In this last session of Ortberg's book, Soul Keeping, he deals with a couple of sections. One is the dark night of the soul. And he says if you ask people who don't believe in God why they don't, the number one reason will be suffering, and that's understandable. We talked last week about the importance of gratitude, but that's hard if all you see is suffering. And yet if you ask people who believe in God, when they grew the most spiritually, the number one answer is again, suffering. See, because the soul is the deepest expression of the person. The soul is the place of greatest pain. We not speak of the dark night of the mind. We don't speak of the dark night of the will or even the dark night of the spirit. We only speak of the soul, the dark night of the soul. And that phrase comes from a brilliant monk named John who lived in Spain in the 16th century. He devoted his life to reforming the church, but his attempts were heavily criticized and he ended up in prison. It was there in confinement, with his dreams lost, that he wrote his most famous work, The Dark Night of the Soul. It is an account of how God works to change us, not just through joy and light, but through confusion, through disappointment, through loss. Because of this commitment in the midst of suffering, this man became known as Saint John of the Cross. He describes the sense of the dark night not as necessarily being a place of suffering, but more about being in a place of the silence of God. When you look in the mirror and wonder if God is there, when you're offering prayers that seem to hit the ceiling. Ortberg talked about this with Willard when he mentioned to Dallas. He said, well, one thing we know about the character of God and the presence of God is that if a prayer hits a ceiling, it's plenty high enough for it to be received by God. But it is difficult. It's a challenge in life. But there's a sense that growth and maturity and patience with God can bring about a sense of depth in our soul that can't come from just joyful experiences. There's so much power that we can learn and become more centered in God, even those times where we experience dark nights of the soul. Maybe you're in one now, and I want to just encourage you. There's ways for us to step out of that. So what do we do? How do we get through those moments of the dark night of the soul? Sometimes it's about waiting, which is difficult. But we remember that we are not God. And we hold on, we ask for help. Sometimes we do less things though. Sometimes we resign from things. We rest more. We stop going to church. We ask somebody else to pray because we can't. But one thing we have to do is we have to let go to being hurried through it. Remember at the beginning of this book, Ortberg learned from Dallas Willard, work ruthlessly to overcome being hurried. You can't hurry through these times. It's kind of like you can't run in the dark. And there are psalms that can help us work through this, that are honest, and sometimes that's a big part of just being aware. There are psalms of orientation, but there's psalms of disorientation. And so I encourage you to hear these words that in these times of dark night of the soul, these will be a test of your joyful confidence in God. And wow, joyful confidence. That's not easy when we're going through the dark night of the soul. But we do learn. We don't rush through. We pace ourselves as best we can in the light of God's grace and mercy. So after the dark night of the soul comes the morning. And this is where we find that we can have our hope anchored. And this hope anchors our soul. It gives a firm, secure place, as it tells us in Hebrews 6:19. Dallas Willard tells us that what matters is the work of helping people know that God is alive and present and loves them, and that this reality that Jesus called the kingdom is among us and available, and that life is precious, yet is wasted with terrible ease. So in our lives we have two worlds. We have the outer world, which is obvious and seeable. It's what we experience around us. But we also have that inner world too. It's less obvious, and sometimes it's chaotic, and sometimes we hide it. But the reality is that the gospel tells us that that inner world is what stays forever. That's that inner working of the soul. And that's why part of life is to find that sense of connectedness for our soul, our will and our thoughts and our habits and our appetites. And when we find that connectedness, that's what brings meaning and depth of purpose for our lives. And we're responsible for that. The reason our souls hunger so is that the life we could be living so far exceeds the strangest dreams we might have. Ortberg ends this book by talking about how Dallas Willard, who passed away in 2013, he would sit in his house there in Box Canyon and waiting for waits while his body goes through the slow death of chemo, and a little slice of heaven's beams through the home, as it does through the most unlikely houses and huts and hovels around the planet. People visit, people call, people write. They say, we're praying for you. See, the life of the village depends upon the health of the stream. And the stream is your soul. And you are the keeper of it.